And thank you all for being here and being right on time. So I'm happy to have an extra 5 minutes compared to what the schedule says. So they asked me to talk about 4 different things, so I could really talk for about 4 hours, but they didn't give me 4 hours. So let's get into it. Cover crops, drainage, earthworms, and more. How do you make your soil systems more resilient? So one of the questions when we talk about resilience, we're thinking about climate stresses that we're having, or extreme weather events, which we're having more frequently. So some of you may be thinking about, well, what are some of the likely changes to occur in climate and weather in Ontario, and how are they likely to affect? No problem. No problem. Okay. How are they? There's no problem for climate and weather. Okay, great. I can sit down. So how are they likely to affect the way that you manage your systems? And what I really want to talk about is, what do we do to prepare? No matter what the weather and climate are doing, we have extreme events. They occur. We know they occur. So what do we do to help prepare and adapt our management systems to better function both now and in the future? So what I'm going to suggest to you is that we're really talking again about the basics. Get back to the basics, but let's supercharge them or supersize them. So we're going to talk about each of these things. We're first going to talk about adequate drainage, but we might do more than just tile drainage. We might do some controlled drainage or drainage water management. We might do some drainage water recycling. We, of course, need to continue to protect against erosion, both by water and by wind, and building soil health a little bit more generally than just erosion protection by practices such as cover crops and no-till and extended crop rotations and manure application. So I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about each of those items and try to show how they, of course, work together in a system. You folks all have a system. You don't have just one practice or a series of practices. You work them together to have them work together. So I like to use the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, or NRCS, definition of soil health to kind of put us in the right frame of mind. And this is based on decades of research, not just something invented by NRCS 5 years ago, but it's the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. So a couple of points I'd just like to bring to your attention. We're talking about the continued capacity, so not just the capacity for this year or next year, but long term. We're talking about the soil functioning. Okay, we ask the soil to function in many different ways. We ask the soil to function to grow our crops and produce food. We ask the soil to function to filter out contaminants. If you live in a rural area and you have a septic tank for your home waste, right, we're asking the soil to filter those contaminants. So we ask it to function in many different ways. And we're, of course, very interested in growing crops that feed animals and humans. So what are some of the characteristics of a healthy soil? The second talk today is going to talk about some more of those kinds of measures. But when I think of a healthy soil, I think of a lot of the soil physical characteristics first. And then later on, I think of the biology. But good water infiltration. We need water to get into the soil so that we have it available. We need some of that water to be retained, right? Storage for plant use later on. We want the soil to be resistant to crusting and erosion. We need that filtering capacity I mentioned, good rooting depth. Trafficability is also one of the characteristics of a good healthy soil, that we can actually traffic it when needed. Adequate aeration, we certainly want water storage, but we also need air storage and air flow through the soil for our root growth. And then, of course, nutrient availability. So this slide is kind of emphasizing many of the physical characteristics along with a little bit of the nutrients. But of course, we're also very interested in the soil biology. This is my favorite organism that I've done a little bit of work with, and you all very readily know that earthworms are part of a healthy soil ecosystem in many cases, and they're kind of our ecosystem engineers. Later on, Cynthia will be talking much more detailed about some of the other soil biology that we're interested in. So the NRCS also has a very nice way of helping us frame what kinds of practices we might want to do in order to improve soil health. Each one of you has different practices, different farm, different soil, so we're never going to have data on every possible practice that you might put together into a system. So how do we think about ways that we can improve soil health to improve resilience? So first of all, we think about minimizing disturbance. That might be no-till, might be some strip till or some other type of reduced tillage system, basically to not break up the soil and to not break up the habitat for the organisms. Secondly, maximizing soil cover is a way that we can help build healthy soils. Again, that might be no-till, it might be cover crops, protecting the soil surface against erosion and protecting the habitat for the organisms. Third, maximizing biodiversity. That might be cover crops, which I'll talk about. It might be changing the crop rotation to have more diversity than just one or two primary crops. And then lastly, providing continuous living roots. So basically having something growing for as much of the year as possible in order to feed the soil organisms and keep them happy and healthy and doing good things for us. So if we think about those principles, then many of the practices that you might be thinking about implementing or that you are using, you can kind of see where do they fit in there, and can I tweak them a little bit to maybe maximize the cover a little bit more or maximize the diversity a little bit more. So I'm going to start with soil drainage, and I know that many of you are very familiar with that and probably don't need convincing of the importance of drainage, but let's just kind of recap that a little bit. In my opinion, soil drainage is foundational, and before we try to do anything else related to improving soil health, we need to make sure that we have adequate drainage. So on naturally poorly drained soils, right, on soils that are flat to depressional, wet, high water table soils, we really need to have an adequate drainage system first before we can do any other major improvements in soil health. And of course, soil drainage is important for timeliness of planting and any other field work that we might do, for aeration, for root growth, and all those other conservation practices that we're going to talk about, no-till and cover crops and so on. They all work better where we have drainage, and I'll show you just a little bit of data from some of our studies about that. So we need drainage first and foremost. Soil trafficability is related to drainage, but not entirely, okay? So drainage is part of that, of course, to get rid of that excess water, but that's not sufficient. Less disturbed soil, such as no-till, can bear more traffic. No-till is going to build soil aggregate stability, which is then more resistant to breakdown by water and wind erosion. Cover crops, if they're overwintering cover crops, will transpire water in the spring and help remove some of that excess water. But even if the cover crops are dead, the root structure of the cover crops are going to help stabilize that soil. So even for something as basic as trafficability, we need drainage plus other practices. So I'm going to go through a few things with drainage before we move on to other practices that help improve soil health and soil resilience. Timeliness, replanting necessity as another version of timeliness, yields, a little bit about cover crop growth, and earthworms and soil properties, all as related to drainage. So I'm going to give you just a few examples from a long-term project that I have in southeastern Indiana. I fully understand it's a different soil, different climate. The point is I just want to make a couple of examples of what drainage does for us wherever you are. So this particular site is a Claremont silt loam soil. It's a very low soil organic matter soil, poorly drained, poorly structured. This site was begun in 1983. I had barely arrived at Purdue when this project got started. So the idea was a soil that had not traditionally been tile drained because of the high silt content, silting in clay tiles, and because of the very slow permeability. And the farmers in that area had convinced Purdue that they needed to do some research on it. And so I got in with some senior colleagues on that particular project. We put the tiles in at 4 different drain spacings, 5, 10, 20, and 40 meter, or 16, 33, 66, and 132 feet. This was spanning too close to too wide. That was the idea for the research part of it. My senior colleagues told me that on that particular soil, if the drains were 40 meters apart, it was basically like they were not drained at all. And so that would be our undrained control. And the 5 meters would be too close, but they wanted to kind of span that range. So you just need to understand that when I talk about some of the data later on about nitrate leaching. The drains were put in at about 2.5 to 3 foot depth, so they were above the fragipan, which was our restricting layer at 4 feet, and standard 4-inch perforated plastic drain tube. Okay, so let's talk about timeliness. During the first 10 years of this now long-term experiment, we were chiseling in the spring. That was the standard practice for that particular area because the silt just kind of melts together over the course of the winter, so it didn't do any good to chisel it in the fall. So chiseled in the spring, and that first 10 years, each spacing was chiseled and planted when it was ready, based on a farm superintendent and me assessing was it adequate moisture to be able to be tilled and planted. So during that first 10 years, there were 3 years out of that 10 years where the planting occurred later than the optimal planting date, even for the narrowest spacing. Okay, May 10th was our date that we wanted to be planted by, if possible. So 3 out of the 10 years were later than that, which means the rest of them were not. Okay, so again, it wasn't a particularly wet period during that first 10 years of that drainage project. And 2 of those years had planting date delays that were significant between the narrowest spacing and the widest spacing. So in 1984, the narrow spacing got planted on May 21, and then it rained, right? And so then the soil was just about dry enough for the undrained control to get in there, and then it rained again. You know how that happens. And so it was an 11-day delay between when we got the narrow ones planted and the undrained control planted. In 1989, our planting date was the end of May for the narrow spacing because it was quite a wet spring, and we had about a 2-week delay for the narrowest spacing, okay, because it rained several times in there. So that's quite a delay, and for all of you who have fields that are larger than our 15-acre field, and you have more than one field, your timeliness benefit is, of course, going to be much greater than what we had. They were ready to drop everything and plant our plots. You don't have that luxury when you've got more than one field and in different locations, right? So the timeliness benefit would be even more for most producers than it was for our particular experiment. There's another kind of timeliness I would suggest that you might think about. After the first 10 years, we switched to no-till, so we were planting all the plots at the same time, because we just had to wait till the top couple inches were suitable for traffic and planting. But in some years, the undrained control, although we got it planted, it didn't grow, right? It wasn't ponded, but the soil was so wet that either the seed rotted or the seed germinated, but then the roots didn't grow properly, and so we basically ended up having to replant. And so in 2017, this is an example of the larger field that had multiple experiments on it, but the high yield green areas here, those were the areas that had tile drainage. The rest of the field did not have tile drainage, and so all of those undrained parts of the field had to be replanted. So for the drained parts, they were planted on May 16th, and they yielded 203 bushels per acre. For the undrained parts of the field, they were planted 2 weeks, replanted 2 weeks later, and had a yield of 157 bushels per acre. So again, we were timely in the original planting, but it didn't work, right? So then we had to replant, and that's another aspect of timeliness where you have drainage. Overall, of course, the yields are going to be different on your soils than on this particular soil, but over the course of the 34-year project, where we had 24 corn years, we had continuous corn, and then we switched to corn-soybean rotations, we had a nearly 25 bushel per acre difference between the narrow spacing and the undrained control, the gold bar here, and an 18 to 20 bushel for those 2 intermediate spacings. So The first 10 years were not that wet. Succeeding years were quite wet, and some years we had a 50 or 60 bushel difference between the undrained and the drained plots. But on average, we had about a 25 bushel yield difference. All right, it's not just timeliness, and it's not just corn yield. By the way, our soybean yields were not improved by drainage. Surprisingly, they basically were not affected by drainage, maybe because most years we plant soybeans later than corn, and so they were not improved by the drainage. However, cover crops. We've been growing cover crops on that field. In this particular year, in 2016, it was another wet year, but we were going to soybeans, and so we let the cover crop grow bigger in the way that we manage it. And so on the top here, you can see our cereal rye cover crop right before we were going to terminate it, and we sampled it, and we had 3,500 kilograms of biomass per hectare of top growth cereal rye. So very good cover crop growth. And then on the undrained control, however, we had less than a quarter of that, so 780 kilograms per hectare. And you could see that it looks pretty puny, pretty good stand, but just not very good growth. So again, if you're going to do other conservation practices like cover crops, then you want the cover crops to grow, and drainage is helping the cover crops to grow, to do all the things that you want the cover crops to do, like take up nitrogen, like build soil aggregation, like feed soil organisms. And they're simply not doing it if it's a poorly drained soil that does not have drainage. So over the course of this 35 years or so, we've done other kinds of measurements at different times. One of them is earthworms. Some of you know I've worked with earthworms on and off for quite a while. Our earthworm populations were generally higher, first of all, in no-till versus chisel, regardless of drainage status and really regardless of location. That's been a pretty consistent finding on farmers' fields and on our experimental sites. Earthworm populations were generally higher where it was tiled versus untiled, if it's a poorly drained soil. And they were generally higher where we did these other practices like covers and rotations and manure applications, okay, feeding the organisms. Soil physical properties such as aggregate stability and infiltration were also generally improved where we had drainage versus where we did not have drainage. So those practices can be beneficial even without drainage, but not necessarily that much. So earthworms, just a little sideline on earthworms. These are the deep burrowing earthworms, the night crawlers. This was a no-till field, and you can see where we've done a little excavation of the night crawler channel there, the deep burrowing channel. That's obviously going to be real important for getting water flow down into the soil and for allowing a place for new roots to grow. That night crawler channel is also lined with the earthworm manure, the casting material there. That's a mix of partially decomposed organic materials that the earthworm has eaten along with mineral soil, and it's higher in nutrient availability than the surrounding subsoil. And so if a root happens to come upon that channel, it's going to proliferate there, right? So we have, you can't really see the dark lining in this particular photo, but our corn roots down in the subsoil are proliferating in that channel, both because they've got an easy place to grow and because we have that extra nutrient availability. So the earthworms are really one important part of our overall system. So to kind of wrap up this portion of the talk, where we were growing cover crops, where we applied manure, where we had no-till, and where we had rotations with hay crops, we did generally improve those soil physical properties, those earthworm populations, and the crop yields on this particular soil. That's a broader statement than on this soil, where adequate drainage was present. When adequate drainage was not present, it didn't do as well. I won't say that it didn't do anything, but it certainly did not do as well. We needed that adequate drainage in order for all those other conservation practices to really work effectively. So my kind of bottom line on that is a good drainage system is really a necessary first step if you're talking about a naturally poorly drained soil. And by a good drainage system, it doesn't necessarily need to be tile, right? It can be good surface drainage, but something where we remove that excess water. the agronomic practices alone are not likely to make up for that inadequate drainage system. And again, that's something that I talk about that we often need to talk to the general public about, because there's often a misunderstanding about what you need drainage for. And even with doing good conservation practices, we need drainage in order for those to really work well. But, okay, I'm obviously a proponent of drainage where drainage is needed, but then I want to go a little step further and say don't go overboard on the drainage. And want to talk about the water quality aspects, because that's really where we have to be careful. So these are examples, again, example numbers from our site in southeastern Indiana. During the first 15 years of that experiment, from 85 to 99, our average annual rainfall was 112 centimeters of rain. And then we look at the amount of water coming out the tile drains as a percentage of that annual rainfall. So the yellow bar here is the 20-meter spacing, and we got about 12% of the average annual rainfall coming out of those tiles. As we bring those tiles closer together, why do we bring tiles closer together? Get more water out, right? I mean, that's why we put tiles closer together, to get more water out faster. And so by the time you get to that 5-meter spacing, we were losing about 21% of the annual rainfall coming out the tile, okay? Then the next 8-year period that I've got illustrated here, 2000 to 2007, our rainfall went up 10%, okay? So we now had 124 centimeters average annual rainfall. Most of that additional rain came during the winter and spring when we're not growing a crop. So most of that additional water ended up equivalent-wise coming out in the tile drain. And so you can see we have the 20-meter spacing is now up at about 23% of our average annual rainfall coming out of the tile. And by the time you get to that very narrow spacing, we're up at 28%. So again, the point from this slide is the closer you put the tiles, the more water per acre or per hectare you're going to get out. Okay, that's why we put them in closer. All right, hold on to that thought for a couple of slides. We're going to get to the nitrate pounds that get lost, but that the water is what's driving that. All right, now I want to go to the nitrogen concentration, and then we'll come back to the total amount of nitrogen that's lost. So even well-managed corn and soybean fields, and really any field that's not a perennial, is going to have nitrogen losses out the bottom, whether it's into a tile drain or into shallow groundwater, that are more than what we want for the water quality, from the water quality standpoint, as well as an economic loss to you folks that are paying for nitrogen fertilizer. Not that all that nitrogen is coming from the fertilizer. Some of it's coming from the natural decomposition of soil organic matter. But we know that our soils are leaky, and so we lose more out the bottom than what we'd really like to. So let's take a look at our measurements that we had of nitrogen coming out of the tile drains. So the first 15 years of that, I have on the vertical axis here, I've got nitrate nitrogen in milligrams per liter or parts per million. The drinking water standard is 10. So we like to at least get it below 10. But for water quality, we actually would prefer to get it even lower than that. But 10 is kind of our initial goal. So during the first 10 years, during the first 5 years of this project, we were, CC in this case is continuous corn. We were growing continuous corn using chisel tillage, and our extension recommendations for nitrogen were 250 pounds of nitrogen pre-plant anhydrous ammonia, along with 10 to 15 of starter. Okay, we had a 200 bushel yield goal. We achieved it at least a couple of years. So our concentrations coming out the tile drain, 20 to 35 parts per million, which is high, which was typical at that time. Extension recommendations started changing, and in the late 80s, the extension recommendation for our area was 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre. We were still putting it on as pre-plant anhydrous, along with 10 to 15 pounds of starter. And you can see that the concentrations dropped, so now we're in this 15 to 30 part per million range. We still have annual variations because of weather and because of yield, In our area in 1991, we had a drought, not as serious as the drought of 2012, but we had a drought, so we had low corn yields in 91, which means that the concentrations in 92, the winter of 92, after harvest in the fall, were higher because we had more residual nitrogen from our crop. All right, so lower concentration, and then we switched to a corn-soybean rotation. We switched from chisel to no-till, and we started using a trap crop or a cover crop. When we started, it was simply every other year after corn, mostly to focus on the residual nitrogen, and we were just using wheat because it was a simple thing for us to implement at that particular point in time. And because we were in a corn-soybean rotation, we could, excuse me, because we were in a corn-soybean rotation, we could reduce our nitrogen further because of the soybean credit. So recommendation was 155 pounds of nitrogen, and then we did increase the starter rate to about 25 pounds of nitrogen, so we're up around 180 total. And you can see that our concentrations are now at or below consistently that 10 part per million range. So the limitation with this study is I can't tell you how much of that last drop there is due to the reduction in fertilizer and how much is due to the cover crop. They're both an important part of that. But other work in the Midwest and Ontario shows that the cover crops are a very significant part of reducing that nitrate concentration that's coming out in the drains. So that's 15 years. Sometimes folks ask me, well, what happened after that? Did the cover crop basically do its thing and now the concentrations went back up? No, the cover crop is continuing to keep those concentrations consistently below 10 part per million. The graph I showed you before was right here, first half. This is the next 15 years, and you can see we're in that 5 to 10 part per million range very consistently. We're growing cover crops now about every 2 out of every 3 years. We're doing some different cover crops. We've got cereal rye, we've got some oats radish. We've done some different things there, but we're keeping that concentration lower. So cover crops have been very, very effective and have continued to be effective. So now I'm going to shift back. So remember we talked about amount of water coming out the tiles. We've now talked about concentration of nitrogen coming out the tiles. So now we're going to multiply those two together to get how many pounds of nitrogen actually was coming out of the tiles in 3 different time periods. So the first 3 years, to give us kind of our worst case scenario, our narrower, bottom line, the narrower spacing gives higher nitrogen loads. So the yellow bar here, again, is that 20-meter spacing. We were losing about 26 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year coming out of the drain. As we brought those drains closer together, remember we talked about more water coming out, and it's carrying nitrogen that's all at the same concentration, so we lose more nitrogen as well. So for that narrow spacing, which is certainly much narrower than what we would recommend for that soil, we were losing 50 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. Okay, so the 5-meter spacing, losing 50 kilograms of N per hectare per year, which is obviously an economic loss to the producer, as well as a water quality problem. All right, so that's kind of our worst case scenario. Then in the next time period, then this is the end of that first 15 years that I was showing you. So 1997 to 99, we got reduced concentrations because of the reduced fertilizer rate and because of the cover crops. And so our overall losses dropped quite a bit, I mean dramatically, right? So we're now 16 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen or less. We still see that stair-step effect. When you bring the tiles closer, you lose more nitrogen, but everything is much subdued because we lowered those concentrations. So that's terrific. That's great. That's what we want. Then what happened in the next 8-year period, remember I said our rainfall increased by about 10%. Most of that occurred during the non-growing season when we don't have plant water uptake. We still have those same low concentrations. Remember I showed you we've maintained those low concentrations for the next 15 years. But because we got more rain and we got more drainage, it means we lost more nitrogen again from our field. Now, our losses have increased, so now we're up at between 20 and 25 kilograms of nitrogen. So they've increased. They're still not as bad as they were initially, but they have increased because we got more rain, more drainage. So this is where I kind of make my plea to you folks. So let's kind of summarize what we were just talking about. Drain spacing matters. Closer the drains are together, the more water you get out in the drains, the more nitrogen you get out in the drains. Rainfall excess matters. Of course, we have no control over that, but if you get more rain and it comes in the winter and spring, which is the prediction, at least for much of the Midwest. I'm not sure if your prediction for this area is to also have more wetness in the spring, but when we don't have a crop typically growing, then we're going to get more water loss, which is going to carry more nitrogen. Certainly nitrogen fertilizer rate and form matter. I didn't talk about form at all today, but we are kind of assuming that you all are doing a good job with nitrogen management, right? So this was not a bad job with nitrogen management that last time period. It was simply we got more rain, we got more drainage. Cover crops do reduce those nitrate concentrations and those losses. And so this is kind of my plea to you all. As we intensify drainage, and I know there's a lot of good reasons to do that, and people are putting in more tile, but I want to also plea with you, I guess, to intensify some other aspect of the management of the nitrogen system, like cover crops, like controlled drainage. Otherwise, we're going in the wrong direction, right? We're going to be losing more nitrogen, and that's going exactly opposite of what we're trying to do for water quality purposes. So as you put more drain tiles in, please do something else to also work with cutting those nitrogen losses, whether that be cover crops, controlled drainage, or something else. Another way to kind of look at this is to see a picture of what we're talking about. This was at the Purdue Agronomy farm a number of years ago. It did happen to be a year with an early harvest, which we haven't had lately, but so corn and soybeans were both harvested in early September. They're brown. They're going to be brown until next April, late April. The alleyway between the plots, green and growing, okay? Taking up nitrate that would otherwise leak away. So basically having living roots to take up that nitrogen that otherwise is just going to leach because nitrate's not held by soil particles. Our tile drain studies in the Midwest and Ontario have consistently shown that growing cover crops reduces those nitrate concentrations and those nitrate losses, often by about half. And that nitrogen's going into your soil nitrogen bank account. Now, you can't withdraw it right away. Okay, I kind of make an analogy to a CD, a certificate of deposit, right? You put the money in for 5 years, you can't take it out without a penalty. Well, when you're putting this nitrogen in your soil nitrogen bank account, if you have kept 20 pounds out of the tile, it doesn't mean you can reduce your fertilizer rate this year by 20 pounds. But it's going into that soil organic matter and it's building up, and at some point down the road, then that will start to cycle back out. And of course, that's a really important question. When and how much, that's very difficult to answer, but we know that it's basically building up that organic nitrogen in the soil. All right, I'm kind of done with the drainage part and the nitrate leaching part. Now we want to move on to soil health a little more broadly. So certainly there's been a lot of increased attention to the whole concept of soil health and how we improve soil health, how we maximize the productivity and sustainability of our soil's resource. And really we're looking at that to get the full potential out of all these other technologies, right? We can't actually get full potential out of our genetic improvements if we don't have a decent soil for those crops to grow on. And so we're also, of course, looking to make our systems more resilient to climate stresses, whether it's too wet, too dry, too hot, too cold. It's going to be too something most of the time, right? You all know that, and it's just getting more that way. So we need to make our soil a little more resilient to those kinds of stresses. So what are some of the practices that you folks integrate into broader systems? Cover crops are certainly one of them, and I'm going to talk about that one in a little bit more detail. No-till is one of those. Extended crop rotations. For us in Indiana, extended crop rotation means going from corn soybeans to maybe corn soybeans wheat, okay? I know a lot of you are already beyond that, but going from 2 crops to 3 crops can make a big difference because you've got different rooting patterns, different times of the year when it's growing, different organisms being stimulated, and so for us that can be already a benefit. And then perennials. Perennials are the best. And those of you who have livestock or who grow for folks who have livestock, that's a great way of improving soil health, whether that be grazing on rolling ground or grazing dairy on flat ground with cover crops and perennials, or whether that be making hay. Anytime we can have roots growing longer during the year, we're going to be feeding organisms and helping improve that soil health. So why is improved soil health important for not only you on your farm, but also for stormwater? For any of you that might work with various conservation authorities that have to deal with cleaning out ditches and spending taxpayer money to clean out ditches, you'd kind of like to have the case here on the left. So this is, many of you have maybe seen these demonstrations, and RCS uses them a lot in the States. So you take a soil aggregate from a no-till cover crop long-term site, and you put it on a screen in a cylinder of water, and the water goes into the soil, and the soil stays together, okay? So it's stable, it can handle water, it can handle rainfall, as opposed to this clod of soil from a tilled field that doesn't have cover crops. It's basically been abused over the long term, or at least not taken care of super well. You put that clod on the screen and the water rushes in and the whole thing just falls apart, right? So it just breaks down, water just disintegrates the soil. So certainly if you're somebody who has to pay for cleaning out ditches, you'd rather have the first scenario. So why is it important to have improved soil health? Because the soil is more stable against breakdown by rainfall. If it's more stable, that means you get more water going into the soil, you get less running off. If you have less running off, you're going to also have less erosion, and so then there's less sediment and nutrients that are in the ditches and less maintenance that's required for those ditches. There's a very readable report. Any of you that are interested in kind of going into this in a little bit more detail, it's called Turning Soils into Sponges. The name tells you pretty much what it's about. It was written by Union of Concerned Scientists. It's really an excellent report. And they basically analyzed over 150 field experiments from around the world. And they were looking at things like cover crops and no-till and perennials. And they found that the continuous living cover, okay, was the best strategy. So in other words, a perennial. The best strategy for what? Well, for increasing water infiltration, decreasing runoff, increasing soil water holding capacity. So cover crops were second, perennials were the first, cover crops were second, but basically getting more water for crop use, including in drought years, and reducing runoff and flooding in both drought and wet years. So basically their thesis was that by getting our soils to be more sponge-like again, that we can actually reduce some of that off-site damage and off-site flooding that we're having problems with. Of course, there is a limit, and I know that you folks had a very wet spring of 2019, just like we did, and it was a very, very challenging time. Once the soil is saturated, whether the soil is healthy or not healthy, no more water is going to go in. Once the water table is at the surface, that's it until the water table has a chance to recede. But the healthy soils are going to remain more stable in spite of that really wet condition, and then they're going to recover faster. So we know that last spring was extremely challenging, but we've had other springs like that as well. So I'm going to show you a couple of photos from southwestern Indiana from 2017, where they had about 4 inches of rain, and the next day they had another 4 inches of rain, just as an example here. So this is muddy runoff from a conventionally tilled cornfield. So you can see the stage of the corn here. You can see tons of runoff coming off of there with lots and lots of sediment, okay, conventionally tilled. Nearby was a cover crop no-till field, and this was soybeans. Usually we expect more erosion from a soybean field, but this was a no-till field and cover crops. And you can see that the water looks, still lots of water, but it looks relatively clear. And if you put those two together, you can really see the contrast here. So here's that no-till cover crop soybean field with pretty clean water coming out and going into the ditch that's got the muddy water from all the rest of the neighboring fields that were conventionally tilled. So obviously, first of all, the farmer, you're keeping your soil on your field, which is real benefit. You're keeping the nutrients on your field. This is indicating all the soil and all the nutrients that's being lost from those fields. And of course, if you're the county drainage or ditch maintenance folks, then you have to also pay for getting all of that cleaned out periodically. All right, let's shift a little bit into a little bit more discussion about cover crops. And I'll kind of state again that the rationale for cover crops is to have something living and growing at a time of year that we typically don't have anything living and growing, so that we're making better use of the time and resources that we have available. We're feeding organisms, we're taking up nutrients, we're trapping them, we're recycling them, and basically improving our soil. Okay, there are different types of cover crops. As you all know, we typically categorize them into three categories. The grasses, whether that be cereal rye or annual ryegrass, or oats, barley, triticale. Fibrous roots help improve soil aggregation. They also take up lots of nutrients, so they scavenge those nutrients and save them for later. The brassicas, the daikon radish is kind of the favorite right now in the cover crop world, at least in our area. Also excellent scavengers of nutrients, but then they have that taproot that is below the tuber that helps, the tuber itself helping break up shallow compaction, and the taproot giving good permeability. And then the legumes, crimson clover, red clover, Austrian winter pea, a number of others, which of course, if you want to fix nitrogen for use by some succeeding crop, that's what you would be looking for. For the brassicas, I'm much more interested in what's below that nutrient storage tank than I am in the radish itself. So here, one of my grad students, we were sampling some radishes, and you could see that long taproot below the radish itself, and that's really helpful for getting water and airflow down into the soil and making channels that other crops can then follow. Roots can follow that in succeeding years. So the Midwest Cover Crops Council, Indiana and Ontario are charter members of that group. Anne for Holland has been very active along with others here in Ontario in that group. One of the things that we do is have conferences and have materials to help people adopt cover crops and learn more about cover crops. One of our latest projects has been to come up with what we're calling cover crop recipes. And by recipe, we have folks that come to meetings and say, I'm kind of interested in cover crops, but I don't really know where to start, and there's too many decisions, and there's too many options. Just tell me what to do. And we pretty much resisted just telling people what to do, because we don't like to do that. But eventually we said, okay, for those who want us to just tell you what to do, we're going to start out with some recipes that kind of give folks the basics. Okay, if you're starting with cover crops, try this because it's relatively low risk. It's relatively easy to do. You in Ontario right now, you've got these little postcard things. They're not quite the same as recipes, but they're pretty much a recipe, seeding rates, seeding dates, and they're out on the table out there for those of you who would like those. There are also plans to make these similar recipes for Ontario, but in the meantime, if you check out our website, there are recipes from Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana. many of which would fit for many of you. As simple ways to get started, if you haven't gotten started, and kind of cookbook way to get going. Cereal rye, of course, is the cover crop that's used probably the most widely because it's the most winter hardy. It can be planted later than just about anything else, and it works very well. There are lots of variations on the theme. Again, those of you who have used cover crops know that once you kind of get your feet wet and get comfortable with using a cover crop, there's lots of different things that you can add to that basic theme. So if you've got wheat in the rotation and you're not in double crop, you can seed a cocktail mix, right? That's one of the fun things that people are playing with in much of the Midwest. These cocktail mixes might be 10, 12, 14-way mixes. You may or may not need that big of a mix, but people are looking at that as a way to maybe add a little diversity during a time period when they're not growing a cash crop. We often recommend to beginners the oats, daikon, radish before corn because they both winter kill. But once you get a little more experience, a little more comfortable with dealing with terminating a cover crop before corn, you could add some crimson clover and cereal rye so that you also have some growth in the spring. For those of you that have corn silage or seed corn or other short season crops, there's a lot more options that are available simply because you have more time in the late summer, early fall to get something else established other than just cereal rye. All right, my last topic is going to be supercharging soil drainage. So we talked about drainage at the beginning, but what else can you do besides just put in drain tiles? Or there's some other things where you could maybe have a little more control of some aspects of the drainage. So one of them is controlled drainage, also called drainage water management, and there's been work in Ontario on this as well. It does work best where the soil is very flat, but it can be adapted to soils that have a little more slope if you're putting in a new drainage system. The idea is to drain only as much as necessary at particular times of the year. In the middle of the winter, you probably don't need full bore drainage unless you're growing a winter crop. And then there's the potential to save some water for use by a crop. So the drainage water management involves using a control structure, much like you would have to control water levels in ponds and so on. And I'm going to talk about this project that is in the Midwest, and we don't have anybody from Ontario that's officially on the project, but we interact with them regularly. It's got a tagline of transformingdrainage.org. It's led by my colleague Jane Frankenberger at Purdue. And what's the basis of this? There's two issues. One is that we know that we have nutrient loss from tile drained lands. We've talked about that, and that's of concern. It's mostly nitrate, but there's a little bit of phosphorus as well. But on the other hand, in most summers, we have some period in the summer where we really like just a little bit more water than what we have. And wouldn't it be nice if we could have some of that drained water that we sent down the river 2 months ago? Could we have some of that back? So retaining drained water on the landscape really deals with both of those issues, with reducing the amount of nutrients that we're sending down the river and having water that we can use later in the growing season. So the drainage water management, for those of you who aren't familiar with that, you have your control structure. You put boards in the control structure, so it's kind of like a mini dam. Water in the tile has to go up and over the dam before it comes out, which means the water in the field has to be higher before you actually get drainage. How does that help? We reduce the amount of water coming out the pipe, which means we reduce the amount of nitrogen coming out the pipe. Some of this water seeps away naturally the way it did before we had those drains there, and that nitrogen maybe is denitrified. Okay, before planting, you remove the dam, you let drainage occur the way you want drainage to occur. After planting, after early season field work, you might decide to put a couple of boards back in that structure, and then if you get rains that raise that water table, you're able to keep a little bit of that water in your field. So that's one way where you might be able to get an extra amount of water that you're sending down the river in June that you could maybe keep for just a little bit longer. So that's one methodology. A second one for retaining water on the landscape is called saturated buffers. It's basically saying if there's enough of a topography difference between the field that's being drained and the ditch, okay, this happens to be in Iowa, it's very applicable in some of their terrain, they're able to take that, the drain before it goes to the ditch. They take that drain and route some of that water right above the riparian buffer, and then that water goes through there, and those nutrients are taken up by the plants and or denitrified before it gets to the ditch. And then the third thing, which might be of interest to some of you who have the right kind of topography, is really recycling that drainage water. So the water that comes out of the drains, if some of that could be stored in a farm pond, some type of a reservoir, and then you recycle some of that, whether it's sub-irrigation or surface irrigation, you might be able to recycle some of that to a portion of your land. And again, we know there's lots of practical challenges, but you folks may know that, you know, there's these fields that I have that are draining, and then there's a pothole, a low spot, not very productive. Maybe I could have a pond there, store some of that water, and then use some of that water to irrigate some portion of my land later in the season without having to put in a well for groundwater and that kind of capital investment. So the vision of that project really is to transform our drainage so that we are maintaining a little bit of that water in our landscape for later use and not sending it all downstream immediately. Okay, so with that, and my last slide is just kind of a couple of resources. I want to point out right away that the Midwest Cover Crops Council will be meeting in Ontario again. This will be our third time in Ontario. We have the date set for next February, so put that on your calendars. Check out our website if you've never been there, midwestcovercropscouncil.msu.edu. Check out our recipes. We have a cover crops pocket guide, and we also have a phone app for those of you who prefer that to a hard copy. And with that, I think I am done, and I don't know if we have any time for questions.
5 minutes.
Sorry? 5 minutes for questions. Right. So the question is, when we use radishes, they're concerned about the root going down and plugging the drainage tile. We've had a few instances of various tiles being plugged potentially from different cover crops, not necessarily radish, and the reports of the roots plugging the tiles are very sporadic. Of course, it's a problem for the person who has it, but that's not a very general issue. We have seen it occasionally, but I want to also point out that a lot of times when the tiles end up being plugged by roots, it's in a low spot where it's actually off grade. The tile was not on grade, and so the water has accumulated and become stagnant. So the drainage folks tell me that really the main reason that the roots end up growing in a tile is if the water is stagnant. So it's more of an imperfection in the drainage system, which is not being critical of the drainage installation, but there's always going to be maybe a few places where it's not perfectly on grade. So what does that mean? It means digging down and fixing the tile just like we do for other kinds of problems with the tile, replacing that 5-foot section and making sure that it's on grade. The other place where people have found roots, sometimes, at least we're having that problem in Indiana, is where their junctions are. Some fields where they've had roots plugging the tile, it's not roots growing live that are plugging the tile, it's dead roots being washed down that normally get washed right out. We have corn roots and so on that grow into our tiles, but generally not enough to do anything. Where we've had the problem is the junctions, and so some of the newer ways that tiles are put in is a tap tee. So they drill a hole in the main drain, and then they basically just tap the lateral into it, as opposed to an external tee. And so what happens is that tap tee sticks out just a little bit, and dead roots sloughed off from the corn plant or from a cover crop upstream come down, sometimes get trapped there, and then you have a log jam, right? You got some roots there, and then you get more, and then you get more. So all I'm saying, that's a long answer to your question. So yes, there's the potential for cover crop. Is that my signal? Okay. Yes, there's the potential. It's not very common. There are other reasons also when people have roots that are plugging tiles, not necessarily live roots. So the question was on our reduction of nitrate over time on our particular project. I mentioned that we changed a bunch of things at once, right? We changed to no-till, we changed to corn-soybean rotation, we reduced our fertilizer, and we did a cover crop. Is there any way to tell how much of that reduction is due to each of those things? No. But what I'm confident of is that the cover crops are a big part of that, and the reason I'm so confident of that is because studies in Iowa and Illinois and Ontario that didn't have all those complications, that just simply, were designed to look at cover versus no cover, clearly show the same thing, that the cover crop can cut that nitrogen in about half. So I can't tell on mine because of the design of it, because of the fact that we had only 2 replicates and I couldn't do cover versus no cover at the same time and high fertilizer versus low fertilizer at the same time. I can't actually separate that all out, which is a limitation. So what did we do with our nitrogen fertilizer? At the time that we switched to no-till, we were still doing pre-plant anhydrous, but in 2003, so that would have been like year 19 or so, all of our Purdue farms switched from anhydrous for other safety reasons and switched to side dress UAN, 28%. So that did get shifted, and that was part of the reason that we also made sure we had on a better starter. So in later years, we had starter and then we had the side dress. We never put on fall fertilizer there. So the fact that we lose most of our nitrogen in the winter and spring is not because we put on fall fertilizer, because we don't. But it did shift from pre-plant to side dress and from anhydrous to UAN.